Hey class, it's Professor Perry here. This is a mountain in Burma. It is an extinct volcano apparently, Mount Popa, and is appropriate to our discussion today about the essay A Hanging by George Orwell because it takes place in the country of Burma. Okay, let's get started. So, as I'm wont to do, I think it's always great, when appropriate, to know a little bit about the author who wrote whatever we're discussing. This doesn't mean that their biography is necessary to understand them, but especially with an essay of such biographical importance as this, it is good to have a little bit of a taste about this guy, George Orwell, at least in this case. Here is a press pass of his during World War II, which took place a bit later than this essay. And here's a picture of him trying, perhaps failing, to feed a goat, which I will assume is on his farm. Now, most importantly for us is that he wrote this essay, A Hanging, while he was a member of the English Imperial Service in the country of Burma, which is now known as Myanmar, in the 1920s. So here is a picture. Can you find him? No, that's not him. That's not him. That's not him. And there he is. That's George Orwell during this time. So, he was born Eric Blair. He did not grow up similar to Hans Christian Andersen of great means, but he gained scholarships and ultimately got a proper English education. And he lived in England, and when he was a young man, he decided to go abroad and get a job, as a lot of people do when you don't know what you want to do with yourself. So he chose to join this imperial force, and after that he left the force feeling troubled about his experiences, which is very much what we'll be discussing today. And through a degree of self-induced poverty, in other words, he got rid of a lot of his own money, he decided to live as what he called then a, quote, tramp in London and Paris. And it was at this time that he truly began his writing career in earnest. And it is at this time also that he changed his name from Eric Blair to George Orwell, something we will discuss below. Now, there is a chance you've heard of him. He wrote Down and Out in Paris and London about being poor in these two cities. You may not have heard of that, but you have perhaps heard of Animal Farm. This was another book that he wrote, which terms and expressions and scenes and dynamics have entered our culture. He also wrote a book when he decided to fight against fascism right before World War II in the Spanish Civil War. He was actually shot in the throat, but lived to tell the tale. He was standing up to smoke a cigarette, and then he got shot by the enemy. But what he's most famous for is the book 1984. And as you can see from this many cold images of this book, it has been copied and printed and reprinted in every imaginable language, multiple editions, and it's a book perhaps you've heard of, 1984. It is a dystopian text, which he wrote it in 1948, so he just switched the years to 1984, and it really predicts things about the future, which many have taken place in the subsequently, having to do with surveillance, having to do with the ubiquity of screens, but also having to do with the way that politically and culturally the powers that be find ways to manipulate those who would seek to criticize them. Perhaps you've heard the phrase Big Brother, as in Big Brother is watching you. That comes from 1984. Other things having to do, like I said, with telescreens, which sort of predicts the notion of constantly being in your phone like it was some sort of shackle that you always had to check on. That appears in the very first pages of this novel, in which the main character, Winston, wakes up and there's a screen telling him what he has to do today or indoctrinating him with political thought, and he is unable legally and physically to turn off this telescreen. These are concepts that come from 1984, but for our purposes, an important concept that appears is the notion of doublethink. And the word is smashed together intentionally. And it's the notion that you can hold two different ideas that conflict with each other simultaneously. So in that book, there's the phrase, war is peace, which is a complete inversion of the truth, right? It makes it so two things that are the opposite of each other almost seem like they make sense. I won't read this whole quote out loud, but you're welcome to go back to this part of the video and read it. But this comes from a definition of doublethink. Why is that important to us? Because it connects to a critical thinking question I want you to think about and answer perhaps in your paper or just for yourself. Now, I'm not going to answer this, and just as I won't answer other critical thinking questions, but it's something to keep in mind as we discuss this and as you read the text and reread it. Is Orwell's decision to hang the prisoner, spoiler, and to laugh afterwards an example of this notion of doublethink? Is it in some ways an example of in which somebody thinks something is the wrong thing to do, and then they also know that it is the right thing to do their job? Or is it something else? Rather, is calling these conflicting emotions and decisions that Orwell expresses actually an example of this sticky notion of confirmation bias? Is that actually more to the point? And I'm not saying that it is, but I want you to keep these two ideas in mind as you think about this essay. So, as we've discussed, there is the explicit and the implicit. And every story, every essay, every movie, every experience you have has an explicit summary. And here is ours. I'm not going to read this all out loud, but again, the idea here is that Orwell escorts a prisoner to be hanged, and he notices that the prisoner is unresisting, and that a dog treats him as a human, and then at one point this prisoner avoids a puddle, and this blows Orwell's mind, and he has a humanity about the wrongness of what he's doing. But then they go on, they continue. The guy prays or chants something that's driving him crazy. He calls it a noise. And then he wants the guy to be hanged. And he is hanged. And afterwards, he and his fellow guards, his colleagues, as well as some locals who work in the prison, have a big chuckle and a drink at the expense of the dead man. And that's the whole essay. But remember, what we want to do after we read the essay, right? You heard my summary, but you want to read the essay, and this is just me reading the essay and highlighting it, and finding the passages within it that really speak to what I want to discuss. These are the interesting things I find when I read the essay, right? So this is the stuff, in other words, when I go beyond the explicit and I move into the implicit meanings. Those meanings that have critical thinking, that require critical thinking and elaboration, and then most importantly, the type of support that will lead us to write these supremely awesome essays that no one will ever forget, right? Because the more that we think about this, the more that we start to develop these claims. So you find all these quotes that you're going to use, and after that, you start to think about them. And you start to collect them and start to find the ones that really make sense to you. So here we have some implicit observations that Orwell's making about how the guards view the prisoner versus how the prisoner seems to view himself, or how Orwell is starting to view the prisoner differently than perhaps he had before, almost like a fog has lifted. And he describes at the beginning of the story how they're like animal cages they keep them in. And then this would seem to contrast with this increasing sense of this man's humanity. He notices that the way that they're crowding about him is almost like he's going to escape, right? They're holding carefully to him. But in fact, he stands there quite unresisting, right? He is unresistant to their holding of him. So the question is, why are they sort of like supporting him like this, right? It's almost though they're supporting their idea of him as some sort of animal, something that's trying to get away, when in fact, in spite of the situation, which is that he's about to be hanged and murdered and his life is going to end, he is not resisting. And it makes me think of when you see police officers or prison guards sort of showing a degree of excessive force, and it almost seems to provoke the victim, the person being arrested or the prisoner, into unfair behavior, unfair circumstances in which their behavior is perceived always as violent or in some ways as a threat, and it really comes out of somebody supporting an idea about this prisoner that is not, or this person who's pulled over or whomever, that isn't really the case, but it's a way, and this is coming out of Orwell's observations, to sort of support your own idea about somebody, to project your own ideas onto somebody. Now, contradicting that a minute later in the story, well, there's no minutes, but as they continue on the procession, and I use that word procession intentionally, is this doggy, right? The doggy comes along. Sorry, that's not how you have to say the word dog. But this dog comes along and he licks the prisoner's face. And he seems to treat him as though he is just another man. That he is just like any other dog might lick the face of a human being. He is not being treated like an animal, but as a human being. And this, of course, threatens these prison guards' ideas about what is going on, right? If this dog sees this prisoner as, see how I resisted saying doggy there. If this dog resists seeing him as a prisoner who's dehumanized, perhaps it's threatening their own narrative, which they seem to need to believe in order to execute this man. So, here's another critical thinking question for you. Is there a connection between this dog and the child and Empress, right? And if there is a connection, which I assume that most people would agree, you don't have to, what is the implication of the connection, right? When you put these two things together, what do we learn about either of them? In other words, that a comparison is supposed to offer insight into a third thing rather than just simply pointing out that they're the same. So what is the value of thinking of these two figures, these two characters as it were, together? Now, moving on, there is a moment which is considered a very transformative moment in the essay in which Orwell observes this prisoner avoid a puddle, which I mentioned in the explicit summary, and he sees this as the moment that he realizes the utter wrongness of what they're doing. It is the moment of true humanity for Orwell in the sense of his final recognition of it, and he knows that he and them are simply equals. They are a party of men walking together, seeing, feeling, hearing the same world, right? There is a sense of equanimity which contradicts the act that they're about to execute. So the question then, is this the moment that Eric Blair becomes George Orwell? Is this when he developed that critical conscience about right and wrong, a conscience which would lead him to become the great chronicler of both his century and our century's political and social ills? Is it at this point that he feels as though he deserves or becomes the man who writes the word George Orwell in his press pass rather than Eric Blair? Is this when he becomes the person who writes all these beautiful novels and these searing critical commentaries? That's the question. Or is this the moment that he confesses his own moral cowardice? Is he avoiding the, quote, puddle of responsibility? It is at this moment that he realizes it was wrong to do, but he does it anyway. The procession continues after the revelation of the nakedness, of the wrongness of what he's doing. So, it is tempting to want to see this as the moment of transformation, and perhaps it is, but the transformation is more complicated than just, oh my gosh, amazing grace, I see the light, I will no longer do this. Now, I think it's fair for someone to respond to such questions and say maybe it's both. Maybe he has a moment of transformation, but he also is unable to utterly let go of what he's doing and just turn right around and walk away. If you can think about him as this character, this person right here, why can't he just turn around, right? Why doesn't he turn around? Why is he drawn towards the gallows, right? This is the question. Because as said, the procession goes on. And not only that, they begin to laugh. He not only quietly follows it, but afterwards laughs with everybody as they have a drink and laugh about the prisoner trying to get away, right? And they talk about pulling at his legs, and they discuss it as though it is a very hilarious thing, right? This is a moment of utter, they're just having an hysterical moment. They're giggling together. And that's the question. Why are they laughing at this? And more importantly, why is Orwell laughing? And he says it in this interesting way. He says, I found that I was laughing quite loudly, which seems to imply that George Orwell finds that Eric Blair is laughing quite loudly. It is seemingly the moment when he is torn between two possible avenues in which to take in his life. Okay, we'll stop there.